The crystal spires of the Imperial Palace on Nexus Prime cast prismatic shadows across Empress Syra's chambers. She stood at the window, her translucent scales shifting from deep purple to midnight blue with anxiety. Below, the capital city sprawled like a circuit board made of light and shadow, home to billions of her people, the Nexeri, who were growing increasingly restless under her weak rule. Another assassination attempt had failed last night. The fourth this cycle. Her personal guard had neutralized the threat, but not before the would-be killer had spat words that now echoed in her mind. The Empire needs strength, not a scholar playing at Empress. Syra's hand unconsciously touched the data crystal hanging at her throat, a habit from her days as the Empire's leading xenobiologist. Before her sister's death had thrust her onto the throne, Syra had spent her days studying other species, fascinated by their adaptations and innovations. Now those same studies might be her salvation. "Your Imperial Radiance," High Commander Vex's gravelly voice interrupted her thoughts. "The Security Council awaits." Syra turned, her ceremonial robes catching the light. Even after 3 years on the throne, the weight of the crown of stars still felt foreign on her head. "Tell me, Commander, what do you know of humans?" Vex's secondary eyes blinked in surprise while his primary set remained fixed on her. "Humans? The primates from Sol 3. His facial plates shifted in what Syra recognized as disapproval. "They're a quarantine species, Your Radiance. Primitive, barely space-capable. Their only notable trait is their inexplicable ability to survive situations that should kill them." And yet, Syra moved to her console, bringing up classified reports. "They've repelled 3 separate invasion attempts by the swarm. A species that nearly conquered us at the height of our military power." "Through luck and savage desperation," Vex dismissed. "Surely you're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting, Commander. I'm ordering. Contact the human government. I want their best security specialist. Someone with experience protecting high-value targets." Vex's scales flared in alarm. "Your Radiance, this is unprecedented. The laws regarding quarantine species are subject to Imperial decree." Syra cut him off, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones of royal authority for the first time since taking the throne. "Need I remind you that those laws exist to protect developing species from exploitation? I'm not proposing we exploit them. I'm proposing we hire one of them." "The Council will never." "The Council serves at my pleasure, Commander. Or have they forgotten that as well?" Syra's scales shifted to deep crimson, the color of absolute authority in Nexeri culture. "Make it happen. And Commander, choose carefully. My life may depend on it." After Vex left, Syra returned to the window. Her scientists had long theorized that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their durability or their technology, but their adaptability. Their ability to look at problems from angles no other species considered. Their talent for turning weaknesses into strengths. On her console, reports scrolled past. Humans surviving in vacuum without suits. Humans defeating superior forces through unconventional tactics. Humans forming symbiotic relationships with species that should have been incompatible. If anyone could help her transform from a scholar into the leader her people needed, it would be a human. 3 weeks later, Syra stood in her private receiving chamber, watching through filtered screens as her new security consultant underwent decontamination. Sarah Chen stood with military precision, despite the awkward bulk of the quarantine suit, her short black hair already damp with sweat in the hot chamber. "Decontamination complete, Your Radiance," the medical officer announced. "Though I must again protest, their biology is so different from ours. The potential for cross-contamination is minimal." Syra finished. "I studied their physiology extensively." Open the chamber. The force fields dropped, and Sarah Chen stepped through, removing her helmet with practiced ease. She dropped to one knee in what Syra recognized as a human gesture of respect, though the slight smile on her face suggested she found the formality amusing. "Empress." Sarah's voice was clear and confident. "Former United Earth Defense Force, Special operations. I understand you have a security situation that needs creative solutions. Syra studied the human with all four eyes. Sarah Chen was shorter than most Nexari, with none of their bioluminescent scales or secondary limbs. Yet she moved with a predator's grace, and her eyes missed nothing as they scanned the room, marking exits, threats, and defensive positions. Rise, Specialist Chen. What I need is more complicated than simple security. I need someone who can teach me to survive in a court that increasingly sees me prey. Someone who can help me become strong without sacrificing who I am. Sarah stood, her smile widening to show blunt human teeth. With all due respect, Your Radiance, I've read your file. You're already strong. You just need to learn to be dangerous. Lucky for you, humans wrote the book on turning knowledge into power. For the first time since taking the throne, Syra felt something like hope. Perhaps the ancient scholars were right. Sometimes the greatest strength came from the most unexpected sources. The Imperial training arena hummed with the sound of active force fields as Sarah Chen circled the Empress, her bare feet silent on the crystalline floor. Dawn's light filtered through the prismatic dome above, casting rainbow patterns across their sparring space. Again, Sarah commanded, ignoring the scandalized whispers from the royal observers. No one had ever dared speak to the Empress with such directness. Show me how you defend against a blade strike. Syra moved through the traditional defensive form, her forearms flowing in precise, ancient patterns. Sarah watched, head tilted, then stepped forward, and easily breached the Empress's guard with a practice blade. Dead again, Sarah announced. Your society's combat forms are beautiful, Your Radiance, also utterly predictable. Every potential assassin in your empire knows these moves by heart. These forms have protected the Imperial line for 10,000 years, protested First Guardian Kex from his observation post. His scales flickered with barely contained outrage. And in those 10,000 years, Sarah countered, has there ever been an empress who was a scientist first? Someone who thinks differently. She turned back to Syra. Stop moving like an empress. Move like a xenobiologist. Syra's secondary eyes blinked in confusion. I don't understand. How do you study a new species? What's your process? First, I observe their natural behaviors, Syra replied automatically. Then I document their responses to various stimuli, looking for patterns and... She stopped, her scales flushing with sudden understanding. Exactly, Sarah smiled. You're trained to analyze, to spot patterns. So analyze your attackers. What patterns do you see? They always strike according to traditional forms, even the assassins. It's so ingrained in our culture that to do otherwise would be seen as dishonorable. And what's the logical conclusion? Syra's scales shifted to the deep blue of intense thought. If they always attack according to pattern, then unpredictability becomes a weapon itself. Now you're thinking like a human. Sarah's grin turned predatory. Let's try something new. Forget everything you know about proper combat. Show me how a xenobiologist fights. What followed shocked the observers into absolute silence. Sarah guided Syra through movements that broke every rule of traditional Nexari combat. They incorporated the Empress's natural scientific curiosity, teaching her to treat each attack as an experiment, each defense as a hypothesis to be tested. Your people evolved for straight-line power, Sarah explained, demonstrating a fluid dodge. But you personally spent years making micro-adjustments with scientific instruments. You have more fine motor control than any warrior who trained only for strength. Use it. Hours passed. The sun reached its zenith and began to descend. The observers whispered among themselves as their empress, the bearer of 10 millennia of tradition, learned to move like water rather than crystal, to strike like lightning rather than a hammer. Impossible. First Guardian Kex muttered as Syra successfully evaded a series of attacks that should have overwhelmed her. This is sacrilege. This is adaptation. Sarah corrected him. The first rule of survival. Evolve or die. Later, In Syra's private study, the Empress reviewed recordings of the training session, while Sarah examined the room's security measures. The human moved constantly, checking shadows, testing lines of sight, her relaxed demeanor masking constant vigilance. "The court is in an uproar," Syra noted, her scales flickering with amusement. "Apparently, I've dishonored 10,000 years of martial tradition in a single day." "Good," Sarah replied, testing the seals on a window. "Tradition is comfortable. Comfort makes you predictable. Predictable makes you dead." She paused, considering. "Besides, you're creating new traditions, ones that combine the best of both our species." Syra's hand went to the data crystal at her throat, but this time, the gesture was thoughtful rather than nervous. "I've been studying Earth's history since I made the decision to recruit you. Your people have a fascinating pattern of turning disadvantages into strengths. Necessity is the mother of invention," Sarah quoted. "When you can't overpower something, you learn to outthink it." Speaking of which, she pulled out a small device and held it up to the light. "Found our first assassination tool. Clever little sonic resonator, tuned to shatter your species' scales. Wouldn't have killed you, but would have caused enough pain to leave you vulnerable." Syra's scales paled. "How did it get in here?" "Someone on your maintenance staff. Probably. Don't worry. We'll use it." "Use it? How?" Sarah's smile was pure predator. "By letting your enemies think their plan is working. Lesson 2 in human survival tactics, your radiance. Sometimes the best defense is letting them think you're defenseless. Now let's talk about how to turn an assassination attempt into a trap." As night fell over the capital, Syra found herself looking at her reflection in the window. Her scales shifted through patterns she'd never seen before, not the traditional colors of imperial authority or scientific focus, but something new, something that combined both. Perhaps that was the greatest lesson humans had to teach. That change, even uncomfortable change, was not weakness but evolution. And evolution, as every xenobiologist knew, was how species survived. The Imperial Science Archives towered like a mountain of living crystal, its ever-shifting facades reflecting the knowledge contained within. Syra moved through the darkened halls with newfound grace, Sarah Chen a shadow at her side. The Empress's scales were dimmed to near blackness. Another dishonorable technique her human teacher had introduced. "You're sure about this?" Sarah whispered, her hand resting on the stunner at her hip. The weapon was a concession to protocol. Syra had yet to see her actually use it. "My would-be assassins accessed these archives 3 times in the past week," Syra replied, her secondary eyes scanning the infrared spectrum while her primary set watched the visible shadows. "They're researching something, and instead of increasing security, we're breaking in ourselves. At night, without telling your guards." Sarah's voice carried a hint of pride. "You're learning, your radiance. The best way to understand a species is to observe its natural behavior," Syra quoted from her own research papers. "Besides, if there really is a traitor in my security forces, then official channels are compromised." "Exactly." They reached the xenobiology section, Syra's old domain. The Empress placed her hand on a scanner, and ancient machinery hummed to life. Holographic displays flickered in the air, showing research histories and access logs. There, Syra's scales flickered with concern. They'd been studying the Void Plague outbreak from 3 centuries ago, specifically how it affected the imperial bloodline. Sarah moved closer, studying the floating text. A targeted bioweapon. Worse, the Void Plague adapted to its host's genetic structure. The more complex and evolved the species, the more devastating its effects. My ancestors survived only because... Syra stopped, her scales turning ash-gray with horror. Because what? Because we were less evolved then. Our neural structures were simpler. I spent years studying and enhancing my mental capabilities for scientific work. If they released a modified version of the plague... A soft click echoed through the archives. Sarah moved instantly, pulling Syra behind a data column as energy bolts seared the air where they'd been standing. Impressive reflexes for a human, a familiar voice echoed through the chamber. First Guardian Kex stepped from the shadows, flanked by 4 royal guards. Their scales glowed with battle rage. But this ends now. The Empire cannot survive with a weak Empress. Weak. Sarah's laugh was startling in the tense silence. You still don't understand what strength is, do you? She glanced at Syra, a silent question in her eyes. Syra nodded. They'd planned for this, trained for this, just not quite so soon. The Empress's security has been compromised, Kex announced formally. For her own protection, she will be confined until the Council can determine. Actually, Syra stepped out from behind the column, her scales shifting to display complex mathematical patterns that seemed to move and twist in impossible ways. I think it's time for a practical demonstration of my research. The guards raised their weapons, but their scales flickered with uncertainty. The patterns on Syra's skin were affecting their visual cortexes in ways their training hadn't prepared them for. Fascinating fact about Nexary neural architecture, Syra continued, advancing slowly. Her voice took on the cadence of a lecture. Our enhanced visual processing makes us superior warriors, but it also makes us vulnerable to certain patterns. Patterns I've spent years studying. Patterns that, when combined with specific harmonics. She hummed a single, pure note. The guards stumbled, their weapons wavering as their augmented senses betrayed them. Only Kex remained standing, but even his scales were fluctuating wildly. Impossible, he growled. These are warrior tricks, not science. Sarah emerged from the shadows behind him, her movements silent and deadly. Here's another fun fact. Humans evolved as persistence hunters. We're really good at waiting for the right moment to strike. The fight that followed was brief and decisive. Sarah moved like liquid shadow, her human unpredictability complementing Syra's calculated patterns. The guards, their senses scrambled by Syra's biological warfare, fell quickly. Neural disruptors. Kex spat as Sarah secured his restraints. Dishonorable. No, Syra corrected, her scales returning to their normal patterns. Evolution. You tried to use my scientific knowledge against me. Instead, I used it to become something new. Something stronger than just a warrior or just a scholar. Later, as Imperial investigators swarmed the archives, Sarah and Sarah stood at a window overlooking the capital. They'll try again, Sarah warned. Kex was just the first wave. The ones behind him, the ones who wanted to use the Void Plague, they're still out there. Good, Syra's scales shifted to a new pattern, one that combined the colors of both science and war. Because I have more innovations to test, and they just volunteered to be my research subjects. The emergency alarms shattered the pre-dawn silence of the Imperial Palace. Syra woke instantly, her scales already shifting to combat-ready patterns as Sarah burst through the door. They've breached the outer defenses, Sarah announced, tossing Syra a sealed environment suit. Your own security forces are leading the attack, and they've released something into the air filtration system. The Void Plague. Syra's hands moved swiftly, securing the suit's seals. A modified version. They've been planning this since before I arrived. Sarah's face was grim as she checked her own suit's integrity. Your loyal guards are falling sick already. The rebels are wearing specialized filters. Beyond the reinforced walls of the Imperial quarters, they could hear weapons fire and the distinctive harmonic screech of Nexary battle cries. The rebels weren't bothering with subtlety anymore. The secure vault, Syra decided, moving to a seemingly blank wall and pressing her palm against it. A hidden panel slid open, revealing a vertical shaft. My ancestors built escape routes beneath the palace, but more importantly, they built research laboratories. Sarah raised an eyebrow. You're thinking of the plague cure. I'm thinking of something better. Syra's scales flickered with fierce intelligence. Every disease can become a weapon, Sarah, and every weapon can be turned against its wielder. They descended into darkness, the sounds of battle muffling above them. The ancient shaft was lined with luminescent crystals that responded to Nexari biology, lighting their way. Sarah kept checking behind them, her human instincts razor-sharp. "Tell me about these labs," she prompted as they moved deeper. "The official histories say my ancestors found a natural cure for the Void Plague," Sarah explained, leading them through a maze of tunnels. "The truth is, they engineered one. And they kept all their research I've spent the last 3 months studying and improving." They emerged into a vast chamber that looked like a cross between a biological research facility and a war room. Ancient equipment hummed to life, responding to Sarah's presence. "Your Radiance," a voice called out. High Commander Vex emerged from behind a bank of computers, his scales showing genuine relief. "When the attack began, I feared that I'd be helpless without my guards." Sarah's secondary eyes narrowed. "Or did you fear I'd make it here alive?" Vex's scales flickered with surprise. "I don't. The filtration system was modified last week." Sarah cut in, her voice cold. "Only someone with your clearance could have authorized that work." The commander's scales shifted to battle red. "The Empire needs strength. Real strength, not these human tricks and scientific games." "The Council agrees." "The Council?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Or the Purity faction. The ones who think our species' evolution should have stopped 1,000 years ago. Better to remain pure than to become something unnatural." Vex spat. "Your research, your improvements to our genome, you would make us something other than Nexari." "I would make us stronger," Sarah corrected, her hands moving across ancient controls. "Just as my ancestors did." "Did you really think they survived the first Void Plague by remaining pure?" "They survived by adapting. By becoming something new." Alarms blared through the facility. Vex's scales paled as he recognized the sound of viral containment protocols activating. "What have you done?" "Released my own version of the plague." Sarah's scales rippled with complex patterns, one that targets neural structures, but only rigid, unchanging ones. "The more adaptable the mind, the more resistant it is." "That's impossible." Vex stumbled back. "You couldn't have engineered something so specific." "Alone?" "No. But I had help." Sarah nodded to Sarah. "Humans have fascinating immune systems, highly adaptable. The original plague couldn't touch them. By studying Sarah's biology, I learned how to replicate that adaptability." Above them, the sounds of battle were changing. Screams of confusion mixed with the thud of falling bodies. A pure-blooded Nexari warrior, devoted to the old ways. Sarah advanced on Vex as he swayed. "You won't die, Commander, but you're about to experience rapid evolution firsthand." "The others," Sarah warned. "They'll be coming." "Let them come." Sarah's scales displayed a pattern Sarah had never seen before, something that combined the precise geometry of science with the fluid dynamics of combat. "They wanted to see if I was strong enough to rule. Well, now they'll learn what real strength looks like." The rebel forces found them waiting in the main laboratory. What followed would be spoken of in whispers for generations. How the Empress turned their own bioweapon on against them, how she moved like both scientist and warrior, how her human companion fought with impossible grace at her side. But most importantly, they would speak of how Sarah proved that true strength wasn't about remaining unchanging, but about having the courage to evolve. The Imperial throne room blazed with light from 1,000 bioluminescent crystals, their glow reflecting off the assembled noble scales. 1 month had passed since the failed coup, and the Empire was still adjusting to its new reality. Sarah sat on the crystal throne, her scales rippling with patterns that had never been seen in the Imperial court before, complex fractals that merged the precise geometry of science with the fluid dynamics of combat. At her right hand stood Sarah Chen, now officially titled as Imperial Innovation Advisor, her presence a stark reminder of how much had changed. "The prisoners are ready for judgment, Your Radiance," announced the new High Commander, her scales showing the adaptive patterns that mark survivors of Sarah's modified plague. "Bring them in." The rebels were led into the throne room in chains. Vex, the council members who had supported him, and the leaders of the Purity faction. Their scales showed the neural changes Cyrus' plague had forced upon them, their once rigid patterns now shifting in unpredictable ways. "You sought to remove me because you thought me weak." Cyrus' voice carried the harmonic overtones of imperial authority, but now there was something else in it, the precise clarity of a scientist presenting irrefutable data. "Because I chose to study and adapt rather than simply fight. You believed strength meant remaining unchanging." She stood, and the assembled court gasped. Her ceremonial robes had been redesigned, incorporating both traditional armor and specialized scientific equipment. She was neither purely warrior nor purely scientist, but something entirely new. "Look at yourselves now," she continued. "Your minds have been forced to evolve, to create new neural pathways. Some of you fought it. Those who fought hardest suffered the most damage. But those who embraced the change." She gestured to several former rebels who now stood among her loyal guards, their scales showing healthy adaptation patterns. "They discovered what I had already learned, that true strength lies in evolution. You've destroyed 10,000 years of tradition." Vex spat, though his voice wavered with uncertainty as his altered mind struggled with new patterns of thought. "No." Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of human experience. "She started a new tradition, one that honors the past while embracing the future, just like humans learned to do." Syra nodded. "Which brings us to your sentences." Her scales shifted to display pure mathematical precision. "The old laws would demand your executions, but that would be inefficient. Instead, you will serve the Empire in its research divisions. Your newly adaptive minds will help us explore new possibilities, new ways of growing stronger." The throne room erupted in surprised murmurs. This was not the traditional punishment for treason. But then nothing about Empress Syra was traditional anymore. Later, in her private laboratory-turned-war room, Syra and Sarah reviewed reports from across the Empire. The changes weren't limited to the capital. Throughout Nexeri space, their people were beginning to question old assumptions, combine disciplines in new ways. "The first wave of voluntary evolutionary treatments begins next week," Syra noted, her scales showing satisfaction. "Over half the warrior caste has applied. They want the ability to think more flexibly, to combine combat with other skills." And the scientific caste. "They're integrating combat training into their research protocols. It turns out many scientific principles can be applied to warfare, and vice versa." Syra's hand went to the data crystal at her throat. No longer a nervous gesture, but one of pride. "We're becoming something new, something stronger." Sarah smiled. "You know, humans have a saying, that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But we learned it's more accurate to say that which doesn't kill you forces you to adapt. And adaptation is true strength." "Indeed." Syra's scales rippled with amusement. "Though I don't believe your ancestors meant it quite so literally as we've taken it." Through the laboratory's crystal walls, they could see the capital city stretching to the horizon. Already, changes were visible. Traditional architecture being modified with new innovations, warriors and scientists working together in ways that would have been unthinkable months ago. "What will you do now?" Syra asked. "Your contract with the Empire technically ended when we defeated the coup." Sarah considered the question. "On Earth, we have another saying, why fix what isn't broken? I think I'll stick around. Someone needs to keep reminding your people that strength comes in many forms." "Good." Syra's scales shifted to a pattern that incorporated both human unpredictability and Nexeri precision. "Because I have a hypothesis about combining human adaptability with Nexeri genetic engineering, and I need someone to test it with." "Always the scientist," Sarah laughed. "Always evolving," Syra corrected. "That's what rulers do. That's what species do. That's what empires do." Outside, the three suns of Nexus Prime set in sequence, their light refracting through the crystal spires of the changing city. The Empire was evolving, becoming something new, not through conquest or tradition, but through the most powerful force in the universe, adaptation. And at its heart, an empress who had learned that the greatest strength comes not from rejecting change, but from embracing it, from combining the best of different worlds, from daring to become something new.